that when we say, or when we ask the question, was Islam spread by the sword? Then we need to be very, very clear. What is the questioner asking us? Is he asking us, were there forced conversions to Islam? The answer is no. And if they were, then those will be the minority, and those will be outside and deviated from the Islamic legislation. The vast majority of conversions, in fact, if not, if we were to put a percentage upon it, we would say 99.99% of all conversions in the early part of Islam were conversions that took place due to individuals themselves being impressed by the beauty of Islam, and that they had been impressed by the revelation. And no one, at least in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, no one was forced to become a Muslim, because if they were to utter their testimony of faith upon their tongues, yet they did not believe it in their hearts, then that would not be accepted as an individual entering into Islam. That person will be still considered to be an unbeliever. And in fact, a title is given to them in Islam, and that they are the munafiqun. That this is the title that is given to them, that they are the munafiqun, meaning that they are the people of hypocrisy, that they utter upon their tongues their testimony of faith, yet in their hearts they conceal disbelief and unbelief and hypocrisy. So that is not an accepted entry into Islam. So Islam doesn't accept that. Now if you contrast that with many of the non-Muslims, such as, for example, the Christian conversions, then no doubt the Christian conversions were by force. That a person had to enter into Islam, otherwise they will enter into Christianity, whether it be from Catholicism into Protestant form of Christianity, as what took place in Britain during the reign of the Tudors, or just before the Tudors, and likewise in much of Europe, where if you were not a Catholic and you were a Protestant, then you'd be burnt and you'd be put upon the rack, or that you would be beheaded, or that you would be hung, drawn and quartered. And these were common practices in medieval Christian Europe, and likewise in the time of in the time of Tudor Britain or Tudor England, and likewise in the time of the Stuarts, and before that we're talking about the 1400s, and likewise the 1500s, when a lot of the oppression used to take place from forcibly converting from individuals from one branch of Christianity into another branch of Christianity. And in fact many wars took place in Europe in those times. For example, the Spanish invasion during the time of Elizabeth I, when the Catholic Christians under Prince Philip, that they waged war and they brought the Armada against the English ruled by Elizabeth I at the time. That was a Christian war, whereby that they did not tolerate each other, so they would invade each other's nations and forcibly convert the people, either from Catholicism to becoming Protestants, or from Protestant Christianity and forcibly converting them to become Roman Catholics. And these wars took place over centuries, forcibly converging. And if that wasn't enough, then even if you look towards that which took place with regard to the Christians themselves, that the Christians actually believed, and dating right back to the time of Constantine and the Eastern Catholic Church, or the Eastern Christian Church, that when those Romans and the Roman Church, when Rome was split up into two, and you had the Western Christian Romanic Church and the Eastern Christian Roman states, that they themselves used to go into lands and forcibly convert the people, and their purpose was to bring those individuals into Christianity. And then when Islam became strong, and eventually Constantinople was conquered by the Muslims, and that is now modern day Istanbul, modern day Turkey, that when Muslims conquered that land, that there were no forced conversions, that the sword was not put to the neck of those Christians, that they had to be forced to come into Christianity. That did not take place. And if it did take place, then there were minor violations that opposed legislation, but the legislation, the Islamic, the Quran and the Sunnah, or the Quran and the prophetic tradition, does not allow that type of forced conversion. And when the Muslims did enter into Constantinople from the east, then well before that we had what is known and what is commonly known in our times as the Crusades. That when those Crusades took place, that these were Christians who felt that the Holy Lands that were under the rule of the Muslims, that they needed to be brought back away from the hands of the savages and the hands of the heathens, and that the people needed to be brought back into Christianity. And the first of those crusades took place in the 11th century, in fact very close to the Norman conquest of England. That when William the Conqueror conquered England, then very close after that, those very same Normans from France, that they travelled across Christian Europe, gathering their forces as they went along, and then they would enter into the Holy Lands, what they regard to be the Holy Lands, i.e. Jerusalem, and the whole of that area of Syria and Jerusalem and Palestine and so on. And they entered into those lands, murdering, killing, raping, pillaging, in the name of Christianity. So really, when it comes to when we talk about the Islamic conquest, then they are completely different to the conquests of the Christians, because the conquests of the Christians were in fact murderous conquests by and large. They were conquests likewise that involved pillaging. They were conquests that involved the murder of men, women and children, so much so that many of those crusades, that it is noted even by the chroniclers of the West, that when they entered into the Islamic lands, that they would kill and they would murder up until people would be wading through the blood knee high of the death and the killing, after the killing and the murdering of Muslims in those lands. But by and large, we would have to say, and likewise the Western chroniclers, they do admit, and historians do admit, that by and large never took place in reverse order, meaning that the Muslims themselves never really entered into that type of behavior. And as it relates to forced conversion, then one need, when we're looking at Christian forced conversions, then one need look no further than the Spanish Inquisition that started taking place in 1492, when the Muslims of Europe were expelled from Spain after having lived in Spain for over 8 centuries, and they had been in Spain for over 800 years, when Islamic civilization was at its peak, when the non-Muslims and the Christians were still living in the Dark Ages, just one step away from cave type behavior, and they had started to live in mud huts, and they were still, partially clad and so on, that the Muslims were living, without doubt, were living in the peak of their civilization. The libraries and the universities being established by the Muslims, and that the Muslims were involved in the collection of the hadith of their messenger Muhammad, collecting of prophetic tradition, that they were codifying their religion, that they were building streets and street lamps, Islamic universities, that they had drainage systems and sewage systems in Spain, and the people were living in the peak of their civilization. Then the Christians conquered Spain in 1492 and began the Spanish Inquisition, the expulsion of the Muslims and the forced conversion into Christianity. Forced conversion into, and this is the Inquisition. The Inquisition meaning that the people were put to mihna or imtihan. The Muslims were forcibly converted. They were forced to either eat or either become Christians, or that they would be exiled and they would be ethnically cleansed. And these were the beginnings of ethnic cleansing, that they would be ethnically cleansed from Christian Europe, and that they were thrown into the Mediterranean and forced back into Africa. And this is what took place, to be honest, and this is what took place, and this is something that has been recorded and well known. But as for as for the Muslims themselves, then the Muslims themselves, by and large, I do not say that there have not been exceptions to that rule, by and large the Muslims refrain from that type of behavior throughout Islamic history. So the short answer to the question, was Islam spread by the sword? And the answer is no. Not if you are talking about forced conversion. However, if you are talking about conquering, then yes, the Muslim lands, the non-Muslim lands were conquered. And in many of those cases, as it is something that has been chronicled and by the chroniclers or written by the historians, both in the East and the West, meaning Muslim historians and non-Muslim historians, that many a time when a Muslim ruler would enter into a non-Muslim land, when they would enter into a non-Muslim land, that many of the non-Muslims would welcome them with open arms, because they were so used to living in oppression and serfdom, meaning that they were treated as peasantry, and they were treated worse than slaves by the non-Muslims, that when the Muslims entered that they were given the right to earn their own living. They were given the right to own their own properties. They were given the right to live their lives. They were given the freedom to trade. And they were given the freedom also to raise through the echelons or through the various levels of society.